Hey guys, welcome back to the Racecast. Now, just like last week, the guest we have on today is was the captain of Pravega Racing back in 2013, and he has also taken a very interesting sort of path after his graduation. Now, last week we went through what happened after graduation and how Tribhuvan got to the point where he is at currently. This week we are going to do something different. We are going to trace back from the current position and see what decisions led to the current position that Prateek is in right now. So, to give you a brief introduction, Prateek currently works for the UN and he was the captain of Pravega Racing back in 2013. And this discussion is going to fill the gap between what happened in between all these years. Welcome to the Racecast, Prateek.
Hi, thanks, Adarsh. It's great to be here. I listened to the podcast both with Tribhuvan and Vikram Bhaiya. It was great. And so thank you for having me here.
It's a pleasure.
So how do we start? Where am I now? What am I doing?
Yeah, I mean, we could start with where you are, what you're doing. I mean, I know that, but I don't think the audience do know that. So we can start with a brief introduction about what you're doing.
Okay. So I'm Prateek. I was the team captain in 2013, and I had joined the team in 2012. And we went to the competition in Italy, FSA Italy, and I think that was probably the last year we went to Italy, and afterwards teams started going elsewhere to Germany and stuff like that. Well, coming to now, I work at the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, which is UNESCO. We all know UNESCO as the World Heritage Sites and stuff like that. But I don't work in that. I work on public policies for artificial intelligence and how is the global governance ecosystem for AI and other emerging technologies evolving. We see a lot about digital platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and a lot of issues surrounding regulation, a lot of issues surrounding human rights, privacy, data protection, freedom of expression, access to information. So we work around those themes, basically dealing with advocacy at the global level with governments, with civil society organizations, but also providing like policy support, policy advice, doing some kind of analysis of what is happening around the world, where countries are coming out with AI policies and stuff like that. And we work a bit on capacity building for governments at the moment, mostly in developing countries, for how they can enhance their capacities to regulate or govern or to address some of the challenges that these emerging technologies are posing across the world. So voila, that is what I do. I am based out of Paris, and yeah.
Now, quite frankly, when I didn't have you planned on as a guest initially, we didn't have. So the way it works is we take suggestions from the guest and then we plan the podcast ahead. And Tribhuvan Bhaiya told me about you, and he told me he was the captain. I was like, okay. And then he told me you work for the UN. So thinking of someone from a mechanical engineering background, a person who was the captain of Pravega Racing, from going to that to working at the UN like seemed like a very huge leap to me. And for normal people, when you say UN, you have this sort of imagination of the way it works in MUNs, and you raise out your voice, you tell your opinions, policies, this and that. But I'd like you to sort of enlighten me on what your day-to-day work looks like at UNESCO and the UN.
Okay, so that's pretty interesting, because what we learn about the UN from NUNs, and I did some when I was in school, is more the diplomatic part of it, the more negotiations between countries around conflicts, or what we can generally call delivery of global public goods. So whereas there is a whole part which is the secretariat, which is the international civil servants. I'm not one of those. I'm a consultant. So the secretariat is basically helping design programs and implementing what is decided at these bigger, what we can call the governing bodies, or what we generally see, the General Assembly. But each UN entity has its own governing body, where there are countries who are member states as we call them, who decide what would be the program of work for the organization for the next year, medium term for the next 8 years, and what is the strategic direction of the organization. And in between, there are, of course, some conflicts and issues. For instance, there are processes to when you talk about World Heritage sites. How do we decide whether I don't know, Taj Mahal is a World Heritage site or not? There are rules which are framed by experts, and the Secretariat facilitates that process. And then there is a whole committee which decides based on those rules whether this particular site qualifies as that or not. I'm simplifying it a lot, but there are processes. So you need the Secretariat to do that. So that's where I work. I work at the Secretariat. I am not involved in like diplomacy between countries, but to actually implement what they have asked the Secretariat to do. And this is based on what all countries agree on. UNESCO has 193 members, so they agree on in these governing body meetings every 2 years of what UNESCO should do going forward. And this is the same for most UN entities. They would have a governing body composed of the member states. So that's the whole overall architecture. But coming to the day-to-day work, based on what has been decided by member states, we design program of work. We decide, okay, we need to, we open up discussions with member states where there is a need to implement. For instance, someone is working on AI policies and they say, okay, so what do you as UNESCO think are the areas that we should look at? What kind of policies would help us achieve our particular objective? A lot of times the objective is, particularly with respect to AI, is economic growth, questions around jobs, questions around how do we upskill and train our workforce, because there's a lot of churning happening. What are the skills of the future? So UNESCO has a big project on futures of education. So there are those kind of elements. And there's a big project around ethics of AI. And UNESCO is the only UN entity. I don't want to be a spokesperson for UNESCO because I'm not, but just because you describe what is happening, it's around ethics, ethical issues, around explainability, around privacy, around transparency, and how these technologies are used. For instance, we see a lot of examples about facial recognition, and a lot of countries using that, and how does it violate human rights? How does it affect our individual autonomy, dignity? So those are questions that are raised, discussed, and then potentially in 2021, there will be a recommendation which countries will adopt. And then they will have to follow those things. I mean, they will report on it every 4 years of what they have done. So what happens through this process is that all countries are facing similar challenges, more or less, for instance, with respect to emerging technologies. And everyone needs ideas to address those challenges. So international organizations, intergovernmental organizations provide a platform for them to share the best ideas, learn from each other's experience, and then to disseminate that knowledge so that everyone can benefit. So this is just like one aspect, which is knowledge sharing. But in some cases, you also have situations where, for instance, with the pandemic, it's a global risk. If one country still has COVID-19 cases, then it can just spread again. So you need cooperation. And this is what these platforms provide. They provide, these organizations provide a platform for countries to cooperate, to agree on certain things, and then follow through. And now we know there's a lot of churning across the multilateral system, with the US pulling out of major international organizations like the WHO, and the enormous consequences that has for delivery of what I would say global public goods. Yeah, this is the kind of context.
Well, there was a lot to take in, and quite frankly, some of it was French to me, no pun intended. And so I'd like to.
But that's the problem. That's the problem. I should be able to simplify it. So you ask me,
Yeah,
because
I will.
there's a lot of criticism that, oh, international organizations are an ivory tower, and we know that a lot of times there's this, oh, they speak amongst themselves and they speak a very UN-ish language, which only people working with the UN, or people who have been working for a long time, they understand. And this was my case as well. When I joined in 2018, I was like, so this is how I write a particular document. But my boss was like, no, 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 you don't do that. You put this phrase, you put it there, you put that, and then it becomes like you hedge all the risks, and you're politically correct and all those things. There's a lot of,
Okay.
so maybe that makes it a bit inaccessible sometimes. But
Right. I mean, your explanation, I did understand some of it, and I would like to go into more depth in other
yeah.
aspects. So, for example, later on during the podcast, I'd like to talk about your opinions on AI being used on different platforms. But for now, from what I understood, you are more involved in the application bit of the actual policies that are being made than in the policy making bit. Am I right in saying that?
So it's more complicated. Uh, when we talk about application, it is, for instance, national governments who are really applying those policies, and they are the ones who are responsible for framing those policies. Uh, Working at an intergovernmental organization which does not have direct jurisdiction. For
Okay.
instance, I
And
cannot influence something
so
in India.
I'd just like to interrupt you there. I think this is a good opportunity for all of us to sort of learn how the actual UN works. So maybe I think we can take like a very small policy example. Let's take the example of the WHO. I think the way the WHO works and the UN works, would I be right in saying that the governance is similar? The
Uh,
implementation of different
I
policies?
would assume, I'm not an expert in WHO
Okay.
working, but from whatever I sometimes read, uh, I would say that the structure is more or less same. I mean, they may have some specific rules and some specific tools and mandates which are different, but
Right.
we can take that as one more salient example.
Okay, so I asked you about the WHO because I was about to take the example of wearing face masks. Let's say that when the pandemic started, the
Yeah.
WHO wants to sort of figure out how to curb the whole pandemic. Could you sort of run me through what might happen in the WHO and how these policies are communicated with different countries? Maybe this is an extreme example. We can take the example of a heritage site, but it's up to you. I just want to know
So,
how it actually works.
so let me just put a very small disclaimer up front. Here, I'm not talking as someone who knows WHO.
Okay.
I am following as much as anyone else could do through news. But a bit, if I can explain how the UN in general would work in these kind of situations, maybe I can take a
Okay,
shot at that.
maybe we can take the earlier example which you mentioned. Let's say Taj Mahal is not a heritage site, and you sort of decide to make it a heritage site, or you sort of want to
I
go in
think
that direction.
let's stick with the WHO mask example. I think
Cool,
that's a
cool.
good example because it's an urgent issue. So this pandemic strikes, and countries are running helter-skelter, saying, "Oh, what do we do?" So they consult their health authorities, the CDCs that they have, and they come up with, "Okay, this seems that the virus spreads through, your when you cough or things like that. So wearing a face mask would be a good idea." Then at some point, there is no consensus. What do we do? So, and in a lot of countries, there are not enough capacities to do that. So we are talking about developed countries. Yes, they have advanced systems, they have capacities, they have resources to deploy to immediately come up to. There's a lot of legacy issues to respond immediately. So they have state capacity to do that. In a lot of developing countries, there is not enough state capacity to do that. You wouldn't have researchers or governance systems which are very strong and which are very responsive. So how do we address that? Then you have this intergovernmental organization which definitely has the capacities. They exist to respond in a situation like this. They have researchers, they have networks across the world with governments, with from what I understand, the World Health Organization. each government is supposed, whenever something like this, a pandemic or pandemic is designated later, some kind of outbreak happens in a country, they are mandated, they are required to report it to the World Health Organization, so that the World Health Organization can coordinate with other countries, can work with the country to address the situation. Now, once that reaches the World Health Organization, they, with their own research experience, with the research networks that they have, they try to analyze the situation and say, okay, in this moment, what we need is for everyone to wear face masks or not. And actually, in the very beginning, they didn't ask people to wear face masks. They were like, no, you don't need to wear it. Let it be for the doctors and the first responders, because there was a shortage of face masks at that time. And this is what countries followed then. So this is how advice percolates. You report, then it is aggregated information from everywhere, and then people think about it. Then they say, okay, the best course of action would be this. So they will produce some kind of guidelines, which is, I think, what they produce. If you see the WHO website, they put all kinds of guidelines of what you should do in different situations while dealing with COVID-19. So then it goes to the countries, and then the countries implement, and then there's this whole feedback loop of what is working, what is not working. I believe, I'm sure they have research councils who are working with them on addressing some of these issues. Now they're working on a vaccine, which is like a global coordination, which is happening on developing a vaccine, on fast tracking clearances for developing that vaccine and things like that. And countries are coordinating, because when you design a vaccine, you need to also test it under different circumstances. So there is a lot of coordination needed, and you need to ensure that there is access to a vaccine which has been approved for everyone. So you need to start working already on production capacity, which is what we saw in India. I don't remember the Serum Institute, I think in Pune, they invested already, and they're working towards ramping up production for whatever vaccine is going to be approved. So this is how it works generally. In between, there is all this political process where, when we saw that the US quit the WHO, they said, we don't trust this organization. We feel that there is a bias towards a certain country. Those kind of things become problematic for the governance and also the legitimacy. You have to understand that the international system, it works based on how countries consider it, whether countries consider it to be legitimate or not. Because when you, in a democracy, we vote, and which gives our governments legitimacy. Okay, if the BJP or the Congress or whatever government is in power in India, we have voted for them. So they are legitimate. They have the right to decide based on the franchise that we have given them. So the mandate that we have given them. Whereas in the international system, there's no such thing. I mean, I don't sit and vote for who will be heading the World Health Organization. It's countries who do that. And when a major country, a major player and a big donor to international organizations pulls out of it, it kind of puts into question the legitimacy of these organizations, which becomes a threat to the multilateral system, which becomes a threat on our ability as a planet, as a global community, to deliver on some of these challenges. And this is where we are in the global system. And I mean, you will find a lot of commentary on governance of these organizations. Yeah, I don't know if I've fully addressed what you were asking. I mean, there can be other examples also, more quotidian, general, when we are not in a crisis situation. Yeah.
I mean, that sort of put into perspective about the way it actually works and the complexities involved. I'm sure, I mean, just because you address the fact that the UN is actually not elected by a set of people, and their credibility matters a lot. So when a country like the US pulls out from the WHO, then it gets a bit messy. And yeah, I think your explanation served its purpose.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Well, initially you said that when you went into the UN, when you were writing the documents, your boss didn't like it, and he wanted you to write it in a politically correct way, so on and so forth. I'm sure there might have been a lot of experiences like that. I'd like to touch on what you started off, how you started off in the UN, and how you've developed since. So what your work involved initially, and what your work involves now, and what you've learned along the way.
Okay. So I joined in, I finished my master's program in 2018, summer of 2018. And over the summer, I joined as an intern. I had just finished writing my thesis. I was still at school. So I said, okay, it's an interesting ecosystem. It's the headquarters in Paris. Let me see. So I applied. I worked as an intern for a few months. And that is when I had some experience working in policy in India before, with a member of parliament. And so I was alive to some of these political sensitivities. But at the same time, when you are out of school and it's a different style of how you communicate things, because it has to be, you have to, for instance, let me give you an example without naming. So we were writing this book on artificial intelligence and for knowledge societies and things like that, which looks at which looks at AI and its implications on society from the perspective of human rights, mostly freedom of expression, access to information, right to equality, against discrimination and those concerns. Then on openness, on that technology should be open and people should be able to develop it. There should be transparency, access, because a lot of places don't have access to human resources or hardware, for instance, to use AI or other technologies to leverage it for whatever purpose they want. And its governance, whatever. So we were working on this, and we had a chapter on gender. And on gender, so we were writing, so gender is not a binary concept, you know. There is male, there is men, women, and then there's different others like LGBTQI, A++. So what happened is that we included in our research a full section on LGBTQI. And we wanted to address implications of technologies like AI for these communities. And we wrote very happily, we talked a bit about cyber feminism and all those things. We were like, oh yes, let's do this. This is super important. We need to bring it at least within our milieu. I'm not saying that everyone reads UNESCO reports, but whosoever is reading it. So we did that. And then after some time, there was some feedback from some stakeholders, I would say, or member states, who said, no, you can't mention this because this is not part of how the UN understands gender equality, or how our particular organizations, this is not acceptable to us and our society. And we were like, oh, wow. So there is real pushback. And this is where the independence of the Secretariat is important. So the Secretariat is a truly independent body.
Okay.
You are not supposed to...
Can you just explain to everyone what a Secretariat is?
So the Secretariat is the international civil servant. So for instance, in India, you have the politicians that you vote for, and then you have the bureaucrats, the IAS and others. Now, the IAS is supposed to be independent. You know, today Mayawati is in power, or Akhilesh Yadav is in power, or Lalu Yadav or Modi, or whosoever is in power, they are supposed to be doing their job as objectively and as in a neutral way as possible, because they are supposed to represent the state. I'm not saying that is how it should be ideally.
Okay.
Of course, respecting the mandate of the political party and whatever the manifesto is, and the constitutional realm. So similarly, at the international level, you have the international civil services, and they compose of what is called the Secretariat, who are the bureaucrats who run this system. So when you see a model United Nation, you have the delegate of Spain, delegate of Pakistan, delegate of Bangladesh, delegate of India, but they are just the political representative of their countries. They are not going to, whatever resolution is passed, they are not going to make sure that it is implemented. They will have oversight of it. So they are like the governing body. They are like the parliament. But behind the parliament, you have a government. I would not use the word government because it is not. You can say a structure which steers or manages, implements the decisions which are taken by these governing bodies. So that's
Right.
what the
Okay.
secretariat. Uh, so yeah, I lost where we were. Yeah, so there's
So you're
pushback.
talking about the pushback, yeah.
Yeah, on the pushback on this on LGBTQI issues and whether to include them in the book or not. And of course, we were protected by, yes, we are the secretariat. This is an important issue. We need to do that, and we can be alive. We have to also be alive to sensitivities and concerns. And that was the first time I saw, oh wow, so there is like real political pushback from countries across the world which are not accepting of diverse gender identities. And so we had to kind of, in some instances, we reframed the language to talk about gender diversity instead of saying LGBTQI. I mean, there are ways, there are pressures, so you kind of manage things in a way. It's not ideal. If someone, the activist would say, oh, you are just a coward. And in a way, I would say, yes, this is what I would not like it to be like in this particular way. But there are these compulsions which one is supposed to follow if one is working in a particular ecosystem. So there are a lot of these kind of issues that one understands that yes, you work here, but you have your personal views, but your personal views cannot be your views which are at work all the time. You cannot be an activist all the time. And one illuminating thought that I mean, it's juries out there whether you consider it illuminating or not. But one perspective that was interesting to me was when a senior colleague mentioned that, you know, when you are a bureaucrat, your activism can show through your work. You don't have to go and participate at a protest because technically you are not allowed to do that. I mean, imagine an IAS officer going out and protesting against the government. I mean, that's a bit weird.
Yeah.
So you're not supposed to do that. But your work is your activism. For instance, this particular person gave me an example that they started a program on persons with disabilities. That's how the UN calls it, persons with disabilities. Even the definition, people don't like to call it disabilities, like persons with different abilities or special abilities, but the UN calls it persons with disabilities. And to build a whole lot of guidance, a whole lot of recommendations for countries to follow. And that, this person said, is my activism, that I could change certain things in a particular way. Yeah. So there are different ways on how one navigates the space. There are different pulls and pushes that you may face. And at the end of the day, it also depends a lot about what gives an individual meaning in life. Work can be part of how one derives meaning or not, and the kind of work and things like that. So that's a very individual, I would say, perspective. Yeah.
Okay. So I have two questions for you. So the first question is, I went through your website. For anyone who doesn't know, it's prateeksibal.com. So you have a lot of work.
So you don't need a plug-in.
I mean, it's fine. So
it was, by the way, designed by a Pravega team. I don't know, you guys know Dheeraj Nanduri. He was in the design after our batch. He's a great designer.
Wow.
Very creative.
That's
so
interesting.
I asked him and he designed it. So yeah.
Okay. So you have a lot of work related to AI, and I think you mainly work in that domain. I was wondering how important it is for you to actually know the specifics of the working behind AI. So how specific, I mean, how much do you know about the working, and how much can you comment about it based on that? Because there are a lot of issues about self-driving cars, whether they're safe, they're not. You can see opinions all across the board. people who actually don't know about self-driving cars might have a set of opinions. People who are in the middle might have a different set of opinions. But then some people consider, even the experts themselves have varying opinions. For example, if you're familiar with Lex Friedman, he is a leading AI researcher for self-driving cars. He has extremely different opinions from Elon Musk when it comes to self-driving cars. So I was wondering, what amount of expertise do you have to have in order to work in these sort of areas?
Yeah. Yes. So there are a couple of points here. One is on the question of self-driving cars and AI and things like that, autonomous systems themselves. One is about how am I related to it and what is my expertise / credibility to talk about those issues. So let me address the latter first. I work on AI and public policies, AI and governance. I don't necessarily work on the technology itself. Not necessarily, I don't. However, to work on policies, you need to have an understanding of what happens in the technology, what are the limits, what are the frontiers, what are researchers who are working on some of these technology questions thinking, and so that I keep abreast of. I try to, because that informs what we can say policy wise, because this is often a challenge also, in the sense that we talk about there is always technology 4.0 and policy 1.0, because policy lags behind and what is happening. So we need to bridge that gap. So we need people who can understand both aspects and relate, because it is not necessary that people who are working only to address technology questions would have a broader view of the societal implications of that technology. Similarly, a lot of times people working on policy or politics or governance don't necessarily all the time appreciate what is happening in technology. And I'm not saying that this, I mean, people at the very senior levels, they do. I mean, they are experts, they are very interdisciplinary. But this happens, and this space is kind of needs to be bridged, and it is already happening in the world. I find I put myself in this kind of intersecting space.
Okay. So I'm curious how you actually bridge the gap. So in terms of going from policy making about AI, so as you said, you need to be multidisciplinary in a sense. So how do you actually go about bridging that gap, since you're not from a computer science background, or is there anything specific that you have to do?
Yeah, I think what helps in my particular case is that I'm from an engineering background. So it's a matter of fact that, one, I'm not averse to talking about exploring questions around technology, because I've been doing that for some time. I did that for some time. And also concerning more computer science oriented questions, what happened at VIT was that I have a lot of friends who are from actually ECE or CS backgrounds, that are like really close friends, who were building drones, which were would have algorithms which would allow them to fly on their own. What they, I don't know, I remember well, swarm logic and stuff like that. And they used to explain those things to me. I was curious. I was like, okay, how does this work? How is this thing flying? What is the algorithm? How does it decide what are the feedback loops? Blah blah. So I was, that kind of opened up a space where I was not averse to learning about these things. A lot of times I feel that we may hesitate, oh, I don't know anything about technology, so I might as well stay away from it. So I think the engineering background helps in that sense. I'm like, okay, what are you saying? Explain it to me. If I don't understand immediately, I'm like, okay, this is how it works. Fine. At least I can understand the logic behind it. If not going to code the things, I can understand what is the thinking that goes behind it. What are the objective functions? I mean, there's this really great book on AI by Stuart Russell. One is an academic book, but one is a new one which came out, which is Human Control somewhere. So that is a great book written by a technologist explaining the logic behind how the technology works and how we need to think about it. And that I think anyone can understand if you try to put yourself in there. So this is where this is what I try to do. For instance, in last year we organized a conference in Nairobi, which was a technology conference which was already happening in Nairobi. It's called the Deep Learning Indaba. It's AI researchers from Africa and across the world who come and discuss the technology challenges, the state of the art. They also have boot camps to train young people from across Africa who come there and have challenges, competition. So we, as UNESCO, we organized a session which was at the intersection of technology policy, addressing some of the policy issues. And there we also had a researcher who worked on explainable AI. Now, part of our research was so we say explainable AI is a principle that AI needs to be explainable because there's a whole black box behind it, that what you have some input and then the output comes, but in between what happens within the neural networks and all the other kinds of technology, the algorithms that you have, we don't understand because it's not possible to explain it. Now, then the policy people say AI should be explainable. Okay, but how? So there is the space where we enter, where one needs to talk both policy and technology and say, okay, how is this being made explainable? When you as a government or an intergovernmental organization is making a recommendation that this should be explainable, this should be transparent, but what are the technological limits? What is technology doing to overcome that limit? That conversation needs to happen. So this is what we tried to do. I mean, it was very small what we tried to do, but this is happening across the world. A lot of organizations, a lot of researchers, institutes, universities, government organizations, think tanks are working on bridging this kind of gap. Great work which is happening there. So this is what I mean when we say technology, policy, linking, and understanding. So you need to be a bit in conversation on both sides. And this is what I mean when I say one, multidisciplinary, and two, kind of interdisciplinary conversations need to happen, because solutions, these are societal problems. This is not, it's like when you or I as a technologist would think, I have a hammer, which is my tool, then I will only find nails to hit it with, So every field, whether it's political science, economics, or sociology, anthropology, or computer science, or within technology, robotics, they have their own tools. They have their own historical evolution. They have their own thinking. But the challenges that we're facing are at the intersection of a lot of these things. So that is where the importance of interdisciplinarity comes, and that is where we need to work together to address these challenges. Yeah.
Okay.